Mirrors by Greensearcher. Chapter 13. So she's been trying to stop the Mademoiselle from breaking the curse?
It would appear so,
Adam huffed. But why? Cogsworth asked in disbelief.
I don't know. I've been asking myself that ever since we figured it out.
They were quiet for a long moment before Lumiere spoke up. Perhaps the enchantress doesn't feel the girl is right for you? He tried. Though, of course, that's ridicule, he added quickly.
Ridiculous is right, on two accounts. One, that witch couldn't care less about me and my happiness, Adam said gruffly, before holding up a second finger. Two, Belle is flawless.
Despite the seriousness of the discussion, Lumiere cracked a grin. Well, I have to say I'm not surprised, Mrs. Potts said straightly. The three men looked at her in confusion. She made it nearly impossible to break the spell as it was, did she not? The woman asked. What with the keeping you trapped here and preventing us from even telling the girl the spell can be broken, and, well, don't take this the wrong way, love, but your changes certainly weren't going to make out of it a piece of cake.
That's certainly true, Adam admitted, crossing his arms over his chest and pouting towards a spot in the room. But why would the enchantress even give me an out, when she never intended to let me take it?
Because she's insane, Cogsworth said dryly. Adam opened his mouth to reply, but closed it again.
Actually, that would explain a lot.
A quiet tapping came from the door, followed by a muffled voice on the other side. Can I come back in now? Just a minute, mademoiselle, Lumiere called out. Outside, Belle fell back into a small chair in the hall, where she had excused herself when it was apparent that every few words into the discussion someone was unable to say exactly what they wished to in her presence. I'm going to figure it out, she thought firmly. She already knew the secret they couldn't share had something to do with the curse, and something to do with outsiders, such as herself, who couldn't be told anything about it. And of course that strange glowing rose.
It determines how long.
Adam had managed that much before his words were cut off. So the rose determined how long. Until what?
Hey.
Belle looked up. Adam had pulled the door open, grimacing a bit.
Sorry. You can come back in now.
Belle hopped out of her seat and reached out for his outstretched hand. I'm on to all of you, you know, she declared, taking a seat beside him in the large sitting room where the others were gathered. An almost amused look crossed Adam's face.
I certainly hope so,
he said quietly, brushing a large thumb across her wrist and the back of her hand. He was still looking at their hands when his face suddenly contorted in fear.
Hold on,
he gasped, looking her up and down, not in the way Gaston would, for his eyes didn't linger anywhere that they shouldn't have, but as if he was searching for something out of place. His eyes met hers again.
When you met the enchantress on the trail, did she do anything besides thank you? He asked nervously.
Belle was about to respond in the negative, but stopped when she thought back to the interaction. She recalled the woman's wrinkled fingers encasing her own, a grip far too strong for one so old. I suppose she did touch my hand, Belle admitted. She had barely said the words when Adam took her arm in both paws, turning it over several times as if examining one's horse's hooves for tacks.
Cogsworth, call for the doctor,
he ordered, turning to the others.
Maybe he can.
I'm all right, Belle interrupted. Really, it doesn't hurt at all.
But what if you were?
Adam trailed off, biting his lower lip as he always did when he was nervous. Belle could tell from the way he glanced over himself and the animated objects beside him to what he meant. Belle felt a moment of fear, but logic soon calmed her mind. It was over a month ago, she reasoned. I'm sure if she cursed me, it would have already happened by now. Adam didn't look convinced.
Mine took 2 years to begin,
he said anxiously, her arm still resting in his paws as though he held something terribly fragile. Belle decided it was probably best not to mention how she had actually hugged the woman when she had appeared in her mother's form. The memory now left her feeling uneasy, and she pushed the thought away quickly. They were quiet for a long moment before Mrs. Potts spoke. I agree with Belle, Master, she said firmly. Your transformation was unique, linked directly to your growth. I don't see how or why such a delay would occur if she wished Belle harm. Adam hummed, returning Belle's arm to her lap, though not before wrapping his own around her shoulders. Perhaps, had it been anyone else, Belle would have thought he was overreacting. But considering he'd just discovered the true reason for his mother's death, Well, she couldn't exactly blame him for being protective. Belle frowned deeply, suddenly burning to ask another question, but anxious to bring up at such a time.
What is it?
Adam asked. Belle sighed. She really never had learned to conceal her emotions well. I don't understand, she started quietly. Why did the Enchantress do all of this in the first place? Why hold such a violent vendetta against your parents? And for so long? Adam's nose wrinkled in at the corners, as though he just smelled something foul.
They did nothing wrong,
he said defensively, though Belle sensed it wasn't directed at her.
My parents, they were betrothed, and that witch came out of nowhere and attacked my mother.
Belle narrowed her eyes. Something about that story didn't sit right, or at least she sensed a piece was missing.
My father defeated her, however, and banished her from the kingdom,
Adam went on, before turning to the others.
Isn't that right?
He stopped. Belle looked around, watching as the teapot, candelabra, and clock all seemed to sag at once, looking away in shame. Adam's eyes grew wide.
That's right, isn't it, Mrs. Potts?
The woman sighed deeply. I'm afraid that's not entirely true, dear, she confessed. Adam was still for a heartbeat. Then, too.
What do you mean by that?
He asked carefully, as though unsure he wanted to hear the answer. Mrs. Potts glanced to the others. Lumiere was frowning deeply, and Cogsworth only shrugged. Well, she said, while it's true your father was betrothed at the time, your mother was not. Line break, flashback.
Presenting His Highness, Prince Alexander of France, and his betrothed, Princess Elfriede von Preußen.
The crowded throne room broke into applause, and Prince Alexander smirked, glancing over at the young woman to his right. She was beautiful, foreign, and would make him an excellent wife. At least it seemed so. He hadn't exactly spoken with her yet, due, in fact, that he wasn't sure the woman spoke French.
Discourse is optional in a marriage, his father had told him after announcing the arrangement, especially given the political benefits of such a union. Your marriage could be the key to peace along our borders.
Alexander had accepted his duty without argument. He had more important concerns anyway, mainly his swordsmanship, his studies, and his growing responsibilities in managing the kingdom. While much of his elderly father's obsession with power had worn off on the prince, Alexander already had a host of ideas for changing things once he gained the throne. Pleased to meet you, my prince, a voice spoke, and Alexander looked over to his fiancée, curtsying deeply before him. Her long, light hair was braided into an elaborate updo, several red roses woven throughout. He bowed in return, as was custom.
And you, Princess Elfriede?
He stopped abruptly as she looked up, deep red eyes staring at him intently. Odd, he thought. Though he shook it off. He'd never seen a Prussian before. Maybe that was normal.
You speak French?
He asked, recovering. She laughed lightly. Oh, yes, Prince Alexander. I speak a dozen languages.
Oh, he said in surprise. Well, good.
She looked over the crowds, now chatting happily throughout the ballroom. They must think themselves quite important to be in our company, Frida said. The corner of her mouth turned up in self-righteous amusement.
I'm certain of it. I still cannot fathom why every last countryside baron needs to be here, Alexander scoffed.
Looking back over the crowds, his heart stopped suddenly, a pair of bright blue eyes catching his before quickly glancing away. He hadn't had a chance to see who they belonged to before they disappeared into the crowds. Oh, he thought, a strange feeling in his chest as he turned back to his bride-to-be. Frida now held a single rose in one hand, plucking it from her light curls. A gift, your highness, she said sweetly, tucking the sharp stem through one of the buttonholes in his jacket.
Ah, well, mercy,
he said indifferently. He offered her his arm, guiding them down the steps to offer the customary greetings to their guests. Being in Frida's company was intoxicating, literally. The prince felt his mind growing foggy, a pleasant but overpowering scent washing over him in her presence. He soon grew used to the sensation, however, finding eyes only for her as he spoke forgotten words to their guests.
Congratulations, brother!
Someone boomed, and Alexander found himself being pulled away from Frida's side and out on one of the balconies overlooking the garden. He frowned irritably, the pleasant feelings of being near her vanishing in the instant the cool night breeze cleared his senses.
Victor, I thought you weren't going to make it, he said dryly, more like hoped. She's so broad, huh? Victor said through slurred speech, digging a sharp elbow into Alexander's side and nearly spitting the contents of his glass across his blouse. He's drunk, the older prince realized.
trying not to roll his eyes at his brother's irritating antics. The celebration had barely started, it seemed. Had Victor already been inebriated upon arrival? Alexander wouldn't have been surprised.
Well, I'm certain she'll fill in the position well enough,
he said blandly, his feelings for the woman suddenly gone as quickly as they had appeared. He looked over the gardens below, then to a descending stairwell to his left.
I'm going for a walk, he stated,
moving away before Victor's drink left the contents of its container entirely. Alexander walked slowly through the rows of flowers, breathing in the evening summer air in an attempt to fully clear his head. Regaining himself, he noticed he wasn't the only one seeking refuge among the plants.
Who's there? He said gruffly,
irritated by the interruption to his solitude. A figure emerged from the shadows, those same blue eyes he'd caught earlier glowing in the darkness. Your Highness, the woman said calmly, curtsying low to the ground before looking back up at him. Though she followed all the proper forms, he sensed a lack of the adoration most other women, or anyone for that matter, exuded in his presence. He raised a brow, his irritation melting into curiosity.
Who are you?
Jacqueline, daughter of Baron Doraville, my prince.
Oh, Madame scoffed, unimpressed. The mere daughter of some unknown baron thinking she had a right to wander his gardens.
Congratulations, she offered, ignoring his rudeness. Princess Frida is very beautiful.
Yes, she is, he said curtly,
his prejudice preventing him from seeing the natural beauty of the woman before him. I could say the same about these gardens, she went on, glancing fondly at the roses lining the path where they stood. They must offer a wonderful respite from one's daily cares.
The prince grunted. More so when I'm uninterrupted, he was tempted to say.
Jacqueline narrowed her eyes as though reading his thoughts. Forgive my intrusion, Your Highness, she said, curtsying again and moving past him towards the palace. The prince huffed. He found himself glancing back just as she passed through the archway leading inside. He had a strange feeling in his chest again, but ignored it as he shoved his hands into his pockets and moved hurriedly through the gardens. Line break, though still in the flashback. It was only the next morning when he saw her again, standing before one of the grand murals. Jacqueline gazed at it with a fondness in her eyes he had rarely witnessed in these halls. His legs had moved him beside her before he could stop them.
A beautiful piece, no? He asked.
It is, Your Highness, she said simply, merely glancing over at him before looking back up at the painting above them. Alexander froze, suddenly bothered by the lack of attention she gave him. Had he been more self-aware, he might have realised it had something to do with his behaviour the night before.
You must not have the opportunity to see such masterpieces where you are from,
he said, his attempt at conversation still spoiled by his inherent pride. Quite the contrary, she said plainly, a hint of mirth in her eyes. I have visited many of the great homes, and I'm afraid yours is not the grandest in terms of its art. I have yet to even locate one Caravaggio. The prince's mouth fell open, unable to respond in his shock at her utter bluntness. Before he could speak, one of the servants moved past him. A middle-aged woman, streaks of grey through her mousy brown hair, decked in an apron and bonnet as she pushed a rickety tea tray across the floor. Mrs. Potts, the woman said kindly. The woman stopped, curtsying deeply before them as she acknowledged her prince nearby. How is your daughter this morning? Jacqueline asked.
On the mend, I believe, mademoiselle.
I am so glad. I should very much like to meet her before we depart, if you would allow it. From what you've told me, she sounds like a wonderful girl.
Oh, that's very kind of you, my dear, very kind, the woman replied, clearly pleased. Yes, I'm sure Virginie would be more than happy to meet a young woman of your accomplishment.
I'm afraid she may be disappointed, Jacqueline confessed. I am all not that accomplished.
Mrs. Potts only laughed. Just what I have expected of an accomplished lady to say, she winked.
Nerves she displayed earlier now completely gone. She curtsied again and continued on her way. Alexander, now thoroughly perplexed, looked back at Jacqueline.
How do you know her? He asked incredulously.
Oh, she gave me the most wonderful cup of tea on our first morning here, Jacqueline said sincerely, gazing back up at the mural. A new feeling swept over the prince. But unlike before, this one was unpleasant. Shame? He wondered, realising that, in over 2 decades of life, he'd never so much as bothered to ask a servant her name before, not to mention inquire after her family. To be honest, the idea that the people serving him had families to worry about was one he had never entertained. Though, of course, it was obvious now that he thought about it. He frowned, uncomfortable with this sense of inferiority he suddenly felt towards the woman beside him. From a baron's daughter. The prince felt that discomfort for the remaining fortnight. The festivities and political dealings with foreign royals were not enough to distract him from his thoughts. He saw little of his betrothed, or perhaps he couldn't recall the times he did. Things did seem to grow fuzzy when she was nearby, though perhaps that was due to all the wine being forced down his throat during constant celebrations. That would certainly explain the daily hangovers. He couldn't recall being so exhausted in his entire life. He did, however, recall the single rose Frida had tucked into his vest each time they met. He found it a bit odd, but decided to entertain the woman. There were certainly stranger fetishes out there after all. As for Jacqueline, he went to great lengths to avoid her. In fact, Adam found himself taking odd routes through the palace in order to do so. Yet, to his dismay, the woman never seemed to stay in one spot. He would often round a corner only to see her gazing upon another mural or tapestry, or worse yet, speaking in familiarity with one of his servants. The prince eventually found a convoluted but safe route to the Great Hall that would venture through those corridors free of art, which he quickly learned Jacqueline had little interest in. At last the celebrations ended, and Princess Frida returned to Prussia. To return some months for the wedding. Early in the morning following her departure, Alexander sat brooding in his study, unable to sleep as his thoughts of Jacqueline continued to flood his mind. He was starting to worry. He shouldn't have thought of her so much, yet the more he tried not to, the more he did.
She irks me,
he grumbled to himself, pouting as he looked out of the window and over the forest below. He knew it was a lie, but it made him feel better to say it anyway. A moment later, he heard the door creak open. Looking up to see a woman, Mrs. Potts, he recalled, move into the room and pick up an old tea tray. She didn't see the prince there until she turned around, eyes growing wide in surprise when she did so. Your Highness! My apologies! She stuttered, bowing deeply and nearly dumping the used tray on the floor. The prince raised a hand.
It's no trouble.
He paused, watching as she stood nervously, clearly waiting to be dismissed.
Mrs. Potts, was it?
He asked. The woman seemed to pale even further. Yes, my prince. Alexander bit his lip, but went on.
You've worked here for many years, have you not?
Oh, yes. Nearly 15, I believe.
Where are you from?
He asked, having noticed her accent. Sussex country in England, she replied warmly, her nerves seeming to calm. But my husband was French.
That's unusual, the prince thought. Even more unusual that she keep her maiden name. Does he work here? She went on, truly curious.
No, your highness. He passed during the war.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Alexander was quiet for a moment, in awe of how much he had learned in the space of a minute. He cleared his throat.
Well, we are truly indebted to his service,
he said sincerely, if awkwardly, turning back towards the window. Behind him, Mrs. Potts only smiled, bowing again before hurrying out of the room. As Alexander stared out over the woods, yet another feeling flooded his chest. It was warm, and he couldn't help but smile. That broke out over his face.
I'll have to do that more often, he thought.
Decided thoughts of Jacqueline might not be such a bad thing after all. The prince wasn't sure how long he'd been daydream thinking when his thoughts were interrupted by the sound of carriages rolling past his window. Standing quickly, he looked down, noticing the crowds of remaining noblemen and their families as they took their leave of the castle. The very woman he had been avoiding was now leaving, just when he wished her to stay. Not really thinking about what he was doing, he ran around his desk, knocking a stack of parchment to the ground as he raced towards the gates. For once in his life he cursed the castle and its enormity, finding himself completely winded by the time he reached the front steps.
Have you seen the Baron?
He asked one of his guards outside, leaning against a pillar to catch his breath. The man's eyes grew wide, no doubt in shock that the prince was speaking to him.
The Baron, your highness?
He asked in understandable confusion, considering the dozen barons now stood in the courtyard.
The Baron of... Oh, what was it?
Adam huffed, glancing round the carriages in search of Jacqueline. He finally spotted her near the end of the line, several footmen securing her family's parcels to a, in his opinion, rather ample carriage for their journey. Jacqueline looked up, furrowing her brows ever so slightly as he moved towards them.
What am I doing?
Alexander thought, unable to stop his feet as they placed him before them. He bowed, and the woman followed with a curtsy of her usual graciousness, though the confusion in her eyes didn't leave.
My prince,
an older man said, bowing even deeper than his daughter as his wife followed suit.
Baron de Roville, is it?
Alexander asked, thanking his memory for finally coming through.
Yes, your highness,
the Baron replied. He was a stout man with the same shining blue eyes as his daughter. His wife seemed to share her smile. Alexander swallowed, knowing he looked dishevelled, but for once in his life not really caring.
My apologies, Baroness, he said. You cannot leave. Not yet.
The couple looked utterly confused, though Jacqueline only raised a brow. And why not, Your Highness? She asked in amusement.
Because...
He trailed off, clearing his throat loudly, scrambling for some kind of excuse that he really should have come up with before now.
Because of the program.
The
program, my prince?
The Baron asked in bewilderment.
Yes, the program. The program for advancing the education of French noblewomen.
Yes, that sounded good, he thought in triumph, raising a finger.
The PAEFN, as it is more commonly known.
If Jacqueline's brow rose further, Alexander ignored it.
Oh, dear, I'm afraid I'm unfamiliar with that ordinance, the Baron said seriously. Yes, well, it's quite important, the prince fibbed,
far too deep in to turn back now.
You see, it requires that we host a young noblewoman each summer to further her education in the arts.
Oh, my, that sounds quite modern, the Baroness said excitedly.
Ah, you see, I'm a bit of a liberal. Drives my father crazy.
Alexander went on, to the laughter of the gentleman and his wife. Jacqueline only stared at him like he had gone mad. He cleared his throat.
As it is, we would like to invite your daughter to participate, should she desire to.
He finished, nervously, daring to glance back at her. I'm grateful for the offer, Your Highness, she said slowly, still clearly suspicious of his motives. But I'm afraid I've already studied most of your paintings during our time here. Surely another would benefit more. Alexander felt his heart sink into his stomach for a moment before he brightened.
Of course. But you have not visited our library, he said in earnest. We have quite the collection of art history texts, should you find that beneficial.
At last Jacqueline's eyes brightened to their usual splendour. You do? Chest swelling in victory, the prince nodded.
Oh, yes. Well, for what the castle lacks in suitable art, we more than make up for in literature, he explained, before getting a new idea. In fact, at the end of her studies, the PNEAF candidate shall...
You mean the PAEFN, my prince? Jacqueline asked, barely concealing a smirk.
Yes, that. Shall have the privilege of selecting the next piece to adorn our walls.
What an honour! Her mother gasped as the Baron beamed beside her.
Perhaps she will select a Saravaggio,
Alexander teased, grinning at the blush that crossed Jacqueline's face. Perhaps, she agreed, as she recovered, looking back towards her father. May I stay, Papa?
I am not one to refuse such an offer, he said happily. Your mother can remain as your escort. I must return on business.
He moved over to the prince and was shocked as the man held his daughter in his arms for a long moment.
I always knew you would go far,
he whispered, kissing her on the cheek as he pulled away and embracing the Baroness. The prince had stopped breathing, never having seen so much affection given in public, never having received such affection since he was a small child. The next morning the prince finished writing up the ordinance he made up the day before, signing and tucking it safely into one of the drawers.
In case father asks,
he thought absently. His father's thoughts on the matter were of little concern as it was, given the king would be travelling until his wedding at the end of the summer, and by then Jacqueline would be long gone. Alexander frowned.
Surely I'll tire of her company by then,
he thought, satisfied as he shut the drawer and moved towards the armoury. He spent his days as usual, trading with Sir Giles, dealing with diplomatic matters his father had assigned to him, and those his younger brother had ignored, studying in the library. The latter, however, seemed to be crowding on his other thoughts more and more as the summer wore on, and his desire to be near a certain woman consumed him. In fact, the two of them spoke little. He found himself listening quietly and carefully to the conversations Jacqueline had with everyone else. Alexander had always been a quick learner, and soon had a mental list of the things she thought to ask each new acquaintance. Things about their family, where they were from, their occupation, their interests. She never assumed things, never patronised, and only seemed to speak of herself when asked. Alexander found the latter particularly intriguing. Even more intriguing, each interaction seemed to leave the other party glowing, for Jacqueline always found something kind to say before letting the other depart. Alexander observed this with the same sense of inadequacy he had felt before, but instead of bitterness, he felt a new determination wake inside him, and suddenly he realised that something had to change. Line break, but still in the flashback.
Forgive me, father, for I have sinned.
Cardinal Marius glanced through the screen with raised brows, surely surprised by whom he saw, but the man only nodded.
Welcome, my son. Please speak freely. The Lord welcomes all who come before him. All right, Alexander said dumbly, clearing his throat. So, well, to be honest, I finally realised I'm an absolute ass.
The cardinal pursed his lips at the prince's vulgarity, but waited patiently for him to continue. Alexander spoke nervously at first, but finally found himself telling the man everything.
I always thought I was more important than everyone else,
he was saying some time later.
But lately, someone's shown me I was wrong. How I've acted. Who I've become. I'm ashamed of myself,
he admitted, quietly, thinking of the way Jacqueline treated others, and how much he still had to learn to be like that.
Guilt can be a gift, my son, Marius explained. It helps us know when we have strayed from the true path. But we should never let it chain us down. For, once forgiven, one must be ready to forget the past as the Lord forgets our sins. I am ready to change,
Alexander said earnestly.
But I still feel I must do something to make up for what I was.
He thought he caught the cardinal smiling through the grated screen.
Well, besides confessing before God, it is always good to make things right with those we have offended here on earth. Do you think you can do this?
Alexander bit his lip, but only nodded.
Yes, I can.
Line break, but still in the flashback.
You have a daughter, Mrs. Potts?
Yes, my lord. Helps me in the kitchen. When she can. Alexander hummed, remembering something said about the girl's poor health.
Has she seen the castle physician? He asked.
Oh, no! No, my prince. The village doctor tends to her when he can. Alexander frowned. Those so-called medicine men were nothing more than thieves in his opinion. He never trusted his own children to them, if he had any. Did servants of the royal palace really not have access to better care? Even beyond the newfound concern in his heart, Alexander would certainly see the benefit of having a healthy staff, and servants without sick children to worry about.
I'll send Dr. Matthews to see her this afternoon, he said straightly. You need not trouble yourself with the village man any more.
Oh, Mrs. Potts breathed, clearly in shock. Oh, thank you, your highness, but I don't know how I can repay.
This is the least I can do after your 15 years of honoured loyal service, he said honestly, especially after the way I've...
He trailed off, suddenly bathed in anxiety. How did one go about making amends with a person he treated like dirt for years? He stared at his shoes, trying to find the words he should say. Your highness, Mrs. Potts said warmly after a moment of silence, if I may be bold? He only nodded, eyes not leaving the floor. Well, I suppose it must have been hard to lose a mother so young, she started carefully. When he didn't respond, she went on. You need not feel too many regrets, my prince. You're still young yourself, you know. There's still plenty of time to change. Had his thoughts been that obvious?
Well, I still should have known better, he replied quietly.
Oh, we all say that in retrospect. She smiled. He finally looked up, and no longer saw the nameless figure who brought him quiet trays each evening, but another person, separated by circumstance, but a person all the same, and, one he realized, was really quite kind. Instilled with new confidence, the prince continued his efforts. Considering any past interactions with his servants consisted of rough orders, barks of irritation, or more often than not, no interaction at all, there was no getting around the awkwardness of his quest. But Alexander was determined, and soon he found a strange thrill with each conversation, and with each new person he spoke to, the castle that had been cold and heartless all these years seemed to spring forth with a new life. Line break, still in the flashback. That is quite a tome, Prince Alexander, Jacqueline said with amusement one afternoon. He looked up from where he sat, hovering over one of the works of Pseudodoxia Epidemica, catching the blue eyes that stared down at him from one of the upper levels.
Oh, yes, I suppose it is. It's Thomas Brown's encyclopedia, he explained.
And you read it cover to cover? She asked in surprise.
Well, it's modelled after a Renaissance scale of creation, he shrugged. I like to start at the bottom, with mineral, then vegetable, animal, human, he listed, all the way up to planetary and the cosmos. By now Jacqueline had moved down from the staircase, a book of her own in her arms, as she walked over. What are you on now? She asked with interest. Vegetable, I'm afraid. Her laughter was pleasant, and the prince found himself smiling at it. It's not so bad, really, he went on. I've always been a bit partial to botany, to be honest. She smiled back.
taking a seat away so that long table. That's why you love your gardens so much, is it not? He smiled.
Yes, he admitted,
wondering how she had known such a thing. Just then one of the servants moved into the room, placing several candles that had burnt out along their long hours of study.
Thank you, Damien,
the prince said, the man smiling, nodding to his master before departing. Alexander looked back at his companion. She was cocking her head at him. You're... Jacqueline stopped, pursing her lips and looking away.
I'm what?
She seemed nervous. You're different, is all. Than when I first met you, she said quietly.
I feel different, he admitted.
He sucked in a breath, knowing this was the moment to fulfill his promise to the one person he had so far neglected. To the one person he sensed who might actually matter the most.
I am afraid I was quite rude, then, he said, looking down in shame.
He swallowed roughly, but went on.
I'm sorry, Jacqueline. I hope you can forgive me.
She looked utterly shocked at his confession before regaining herself. Of course, Your Highness, she breathed. They were quiet for a long moment, though it wasn't unpleasant. Alexander felt like an enormous burden had been torn from his shoulders, and he couldn't help but smile at the lightness in his chest. He glanced out to the gardens, then back at her.
Would you care to join me? He asked. It isn't healthy to sit for so long.
She pursed her lips, looking out of the tall windows before meeting his eyes. Yes, she said, blushing a bit. Yes, all right. As the summer days passed, their hours together grew in number. Long walks were spent in the garden, as the prince named each plant one by one. Others spent traversing the large palace, as Jacqueline told him the history of each work of art. Any remaining time was spent in the library, their proximity growing with each day until they found it impossible to sit any closer. The Baroness did little to interfere. When she wasn't beaming at the sight of them, she was asleep in her chair. Merely a fortnight away from his own wedding, and Alexander knew he had to distance himself. Yet each time he tried, he only came back with a greater desire to be near her.
This isn't good,
he told himself one night, alone in his dark chambers, stomach churning at the thought of watching his dear Jacqueline depart in just a few days' time. At the thought of being with another while she lived and breathed in his world.
I can't do it, he breathed. I won't do it.
He soon found himself in the halls of the castle, ceiling melting into the darkness up above, a single candle in one hand as he moved towards the guest wing. Your Highness, she asked, pulling open the door to his soft knock, tugging a thin shawl further around her shoulders and staring at him in bewilderment. He must have looked a sight, standing in that dark hallway, shirt half unbuttoned, hair a mess around his shoulders from running a hand through it.
Jacqueline, he gasped. I'm sorry to wake you.
You didn't, she said, looking around him anxiously as she stepped into the hall and pulling the door shut behind her. She tugged up the shawl once more, her dark hair falling in pretty waves down to her waist. He had never seen it down, aching to run his fingers through it, aching to hold her close and never have to think about Frieda von Prussian ever again. What's happened? She asked nervously, looking back up at him.
Nothing. I just... He stopped, feeling a tumble of emotions wash over him, knowing his face was telling all but unable to hide it from her any longer. My prince? She whispered with concern, reaching gentle fingers up towards his face. As they touched his jaw, he caught them in his own. Her hand was soft, and he let the skin brush his cheek as he turned to kiss her palm. Oh, Alexander, she shuddered, chest rising and falling heavily in the darkness. She had never spoken his name without a title, and the sound of it seemed to awaken something inside him. The candle fell heavily onto the narrow table beside them, his free hand cradling her face as he closed the distance between them, with a sudden, desperate urgency. She gasped quietly, but relaxed into an instant as they melted together. Alexander wasn't sure how long it lasted. All he felt were her lips, soft and warm, and her chest rising shallowly against his. All he knew was that he could do this forever, and never feel it could measure up to what he had felt for her. A feeling he had never imagined was possible. She pulled back too soon. You're betrothed, she whispered, her voice shaky and laced with guilt as she looked away. I don't care,
he breathed, pulling her beautiful hair from her temple, running his fingers down her cheek.
I'll call it off.
But what about Princess Frida? Jacqueline asked. She took a deep, brave breath. It wouldn't be fair to her.
She's young, and comes from a powerful family. She won't have a problem finding another,
he explained absently.
Besides, I barely know her.
Jacqueline stepped away. You seemed to know her quite well while she was here, she said coldly.
What?
I've been such a fool, she breathed, looking terribly hurt as she stared at the floor. I thought you had changed. I thought this meant something.
It does mean something,
Alexander cried in desperate confusion. He tried to reach out to her, but she only turned away further.
Jacqueline, please, I don't understand. What have I done?
She finally looked back at him, eyes searching his for a long minute before growing wide. You really don't remember, do you?
Remember what? He asked anxiously. Jacqueline, you're frightening me.
Alexander, what we just did? You did the same with the princess each night she was here.
What? He asked incredulously. No, I didn't.
People saw you. I saw you once, she admitted with embarrassment. In the gardens.
But I didn't. I didn't.
He stopped, a sudden fear washing over him. He tried desperately to recall the fortnight the princess had been here. But he could barely conjure up an image of the girl's face, not to mention anything that had happened.
Oh God. Oh God. I can't remember any of it, he admitted, feeling sick to his stomach.
He looked back at Jacqueline with quaking eyes.
You don't think she made me?
People would have noticed if you were both missing for too long, she assured him. And I'm quite sure she only kissed you. And, considering you're a terrible liar, she deducted with a raised brow, I'm now also certain she drugged you. Alexander brought a shaky hand to his temple.
That's why I was so tired,
he said to himself, trying to hold in the panic in his chest.
But why? We were already betrothed. What could she have possibly gained from...
He stopped as his thoughts caught up with his mind.
Good God, what if she means to control my actions as a ruler too? What kind of poison could do that? How could I possibly fight something like...
He stopped again, as Jacqueline placed a calm hand on his arm. It will be all right, she said firmly. I believe you. And now we know the truth. We can do something about it.
Yes, you're right,
he admitted. The prince reached out for her again, and this time she accepted the embrace. He pulled her close, letting her warmth ease his fears, if just for a moment.
You saved me, you know,
he whispered. I'm certain someone would have noticed. If not me, she said, looking up at him fondly.
I'm not so sure, he said. But I didn't mean this. You saved me from the man I was.
You changed because you were willing to, Alexander. God, he loved the way his name sounded coming from her lips.
No. He loved her.
Could he say it? Now?
Jacqueline, he breathed.
You dirty traitor! Alexander froze, heart flying into his throat. He felt Jacqueline grip his shirt hard, looking over at his shoulder with wide, unblinking eyes. Turning around slowly, he saw a small form across the hall. The young woman wore a long, wide, red gown, covered in fine jewels that glimmered in the small light of the candle beside her.
Princess Frida? He said in utter shock. How are you here?
What? Isn't your dear fiancée welcome in her future home? The young woman said scathingly. Or am I interrupting your filthy betrayal? Alexander bristled.
My betrayal?
He snarled angrily, holding a protective arm across Jacqueline. She was still in shock, eyes staring wide at a point across the room. Alexander sucked in an angry breath, staring back at his betrothed.
You poisoned me, he cried. You've broken my trust, my kingdom's trust. There's no way I could marry you now.
Alexander, Jacqueline whispered from behind him. She came through the... I didn't poison you, love, Frida said, moving towards them slowly. Her red eyes glowed as she came into the light, mouth curling into an unnerving grin. I bewitched you, and I'll do it again. Without warning, a dozen red roses bloomed in her hair. At the same time, Alexander recalled the single rose she had tucked into his shirt every day of his visit, the lulling scent that always seemed to surround her. His eyes grew wide as he put two and two together. "No!" he gasped, pressing a hand over his mouth and nose, before whatever strange power those flowers possessed could overwhelm him. A moment later he felt a soft hand grab his other. "Hurry!" Jacqueline cried, tugging him towards the darkness. Alexander quickly followed, but after 2 steps found himself blocked by some unseen force. Jacqueline pulled harder, but it was no use. Something was stopping him from following. He released her hand, running it along the force in all directions, but found no break in the strange brick-like surface that separated them. Heart sinking in his chest, the prince looked back down at the woman that he loved. He stared at her blue eyes, shaking his head to explain, mind starting to run numb from lack of air. He looked behind them. The princess hadn't moved. The only change for her smirk was broken into a full-toothed grin. "You can't hold your breath forever, Prince Alexander." He swallowed roughly. She was right, and it wasn't long before he felt his eyes water and his legs tremble. He was partly aware of Jacqueline beside him again, holding him steady as he sank to his knees. "Run, Jacqueline!" he thought fiercely, but feared that if he cried out he might breathe in that strange, powerful scent. And then he knew what Princess Freedom might force him to do. Could he hurt Jacqueline under her... dare he call it a spell? "What's the matter? I thought you were so fond of your roses," Frida mocked. She stopped, expression falling into a scowl full of rage. "Hundreds of them in your garden, and yet you couldn't spare one for a child." Alexander blinked in confusion. What is she talking about? He wondered, lungs burning as he held out further. Frida snarled, nose wrinkling in disgust. "Of course you don't remember. You people can pen your name to a page and sentence a nation to its fate. Yet he couldn't care less to take notice of it." "Alexander!" Jacqueline whispered desperately, arms wrapping around him. "You couldn't find a thread of mercy in your heart for a child. Couldn't see the beauty in anyone like me," Frida went on. "But that will change. You will choose me, and everything I was forbidden before will be mine." Against his will, the prince finally succumbed. Body forcing in air, he had denied it the last few minutes. He waited for the flower's scent to flood over him, waiting for the world to blur and fade. But it didn't. In fact, he smelled nothing, felt nothing, though the roses opened even more before his eyes. Princess Frida, for her part, seemed equally shocked. "Why isn't it working?" she said under her breath, stepping away. "It worked back when..." She stopped, head snapping up, eyes boring into the woman beside him. "You!" she snarled at Jacqueline. Regaining his strength, Alexander stood and pulled Jacqueline behind him, once again gritting his teeth. "Leave her out of this! She's done nothing!" "You're stopping my spell!" the princess cried, ignoring his play and pointing one thin, wren-tipped finger at Jacqueline's heart. Frida's chest rose and fell in anger, a strange light starting to pool at her fingertips. "Run, Jacqueline!" Alexander breathed. "I don't know what she's capable of." "But Alexander, you'll be trapped here without anyone to..." "This is my burden. Somehow I've offended a witch." How strange the word sounded. He hadn't believed in such a thing until 10 minutes ago. But, well, he couldn't explain what was happening any other way. Jacqueline sucked in a frustrated breath, but nodded quickly before running off. It was what he had wanted after all, but he never felt so suddenly alone. The princess frowned towards Jacqueline's form as it vanished, but soon shrugged. "Didn't take much to persuade her, did it?" "Perhaps she doesn't love you, after all," she grinned cruelly. Alexander grit his teeth, but forced himself to look up at the intruder again. "I can't remember how I hurt you," he started quietly, "but I can certainly believe I was capable of such. And I'm sorry." "Apologies aren't good enough," Frida said darkly. "Isn't that what you told me?" Alexander blinked, still no memory of such an interaction. "How long ago did this happen?" he asked. 18 years this day." 18 years? I was just a boy!" he cried in disbelief. "Surely you can forgive me that." "I was just a girl, dear prince. Yet I received no mercy." She stopped, nose wrinkling at the corners. "No, you'll suffer for your actions as a child, just as I did. But don't worry, dearest," she went on, smiling again. "Many would kill for such a punishment." Before he could blink, the princess began to grow. to change. No longer the petite, delicate girl from before. She now towered over him, body filling out, lips growing full, hair falling from its careful arrangement into heavy locks around her shoulders. She was beautiful. Terrifying, but beautiful.
Who are you? The prince asked in fear. Where is Princess Frida?
He stopped, narrowing his eyes.
Or was there ever a Frida to begin with?
Oh, there was. Though you never actually met her. A fearful little thing, really. Though I do tend to have that effect on people. She stopped, twirling one of her curls around a lazy finger. I've hidden her quite well. Couldn't have the two of us wandering around, you know.
Alexander's heart sank into his stomach. So he'd brought an innocent into this mess too?
I'm not so bad. Am I? She went on, moving closer to him and licking her lips.
Alexander backed away as far as he could, pressed against the strange force behind him.
Forget that woman, the witch went on. She's nothing compared to me.
Forget Jacqueline?
Alexander asked in disbelief.
You can't just stop loving someone.
The witch narrowed her eyes. Yes, you can, she said darkly. He stared at her for a long moment, heart pounding in his ears.
I don't understand,
he went on, trying to buy himself time to think of a way out of this.
If you hate me so much, why do you desire me?
Well, you are quite handsome, your highness.
No, Alexander frowned. No, you want to control me. You want what I have.
A few careless words from your lips took everything I had, she said. Such power, such control over the lives of those beneath you. Oh, how it would feel to have it for myself. To have such power over you, dear prince. She paused. Though, I wasn't lying. Your looks would be a perk to the arrangement.
I'll never accept you, Alexander said in disgust. And your spell is useless. Begone, witch!
She only laughed. Her terrible cackle ringing through the halls. Perhaps love stops this spell, she said, plucking a loose rose from her hair and tossing it aside. But my power doesn't end there, dear prince. The light from the witch's hands glowed once again, bright chains shooting from her fingertips. Alexander dodged them quickly, suddenly grateful that Giles insisted he trained more including than simple swordsmanship. The witch seemed surprised by his agility, and her moment of hesitation. He caught the sounds of heavy footfalls pounding down the hallway. The sound of metal on stone made him turn, and a sword slid to his side, glinting in the faint candlelight. He looked up. A woman with bright, blue eyes racing towards him, a troop of men at her heels. Jacqueline! Of course she hadn't abandoned him. He felt his chest swell with warmth, grabbing the sword she'd thrown at him and rising quickly to his feet just in time to dodge a second attack. The witch hissed, eyes growing wide as the soldiers as they grew near. She raised a hand towards them, but the prince was upon her in an instant, swiping his sword mere inches from her throat. She backed up quickly, but Alexander didn't stop. He wasn't going to give her a chance to hurt them, to hurt Jacqueline. He fought with a passion, swinging the blade with each attempt she made to cast a spell. Though he had trained for years in swordsmanship, he had never had an opportunity to actually use it. He sensed the present circumstance was not a common application. Soon his men circled him, providing relief to their prince. The witch's eyes grew wide in fury. Before Alexander could react, she had let those deadly blossoms in her hair open wide again.
Back! He cried, several men already growing glassy-eyed by the scent. Don't get too close! Don't breathe it in!
Beside him, Sir Giles shouted to his men to obey. They backed away at once, dragging those already intoxicated behind them, watching nervously as their prince continued to fight alone.
Open the windows!
Giles cried. The sentries obeyed. Soon the midnight winds were flooding the hall. Though Alexander couldn't smell the roses, it was obvious he had done the trick as the spellbound men returned to awareness in an instant. The witch hissed, and Alexander could tell he was wearing her down. Her size made her slow, and he noticed her ragged breathing increase the longer they fought. With several men attacking at once, she could barely send a glowing chain towards one man before being forced to face another. She seemed to be growing more confused by the minute, and the prince wondered if she had had less experience in true combat than himself. They soon had her backed against the wall. It held a grand mirror, reflecting the large hall and the men nearly upon her.
You have nowhere to go, witch,
Alexander said, breathing heavily, and holding his weapon towards her chest. His men surrounded them on all sides, their own spears forming a circle which no one could escape.
Surrender now if you wish to keep your life.
She glanced at the mirror behind her, then turned back to him and grinned. Her lips were lopsided and her eyes were full of mirth. "Not so fast, your highness," she replied. She turned, placing a palm against the flat of the glass. It began to tremble, the reflections slowly fading into blackness until, crash! The mirror shattered into 100 pieces, all scattered along the floor, along with a single candlestick that someone had hurled at its surface, the very one he had carried here that night. Alexander looked behind him, catching sight of Jacqueline with her arm outstretched. She pulled it back, exhaling heavily, and catching his eyes. "She came through the mirror," she explained.
"No!"
the witch gasped, staring at Jacqueline in rage. "7 years bad luck to you!" she screamed, throwing out an accusatory finger as a dozen men detained her in an instant. "I don't believe in such superstitions," Jacqueline said calmly, regaining her breath and standing tall once again. "I'm Catholic." Despite all that had happened, Alexander couldn't help but crack a grin. "Ah!" the witch shrieked, now forced to her knees, hands held stiffly behind her back as she continued to scream with fury.
"What shall we do with her, my lord?"
someone asked. Alexander looked up. Sir Giles stood before him, a grim look on his face. "Gotta burn these witch folk," another man said fiercely, "or else you'll never be rid of them." The prince frowned. A few weeks ago he may have agreed to such a proposal in an instant, but he wasn't the same man as he was then.
"Secure her in the tower," he directed solemnly. "I need to speak with her before anything is decided."
Line break still in the flashback.
"Where is she?"
The witch sat in a cold cell, limbs bound by tight chains secured to the wall. It was a strange sight. Such a beautiful woman, clothed in a rich gown, sitting on the damp prison floor. In response to his question, she only shrugged.
"You will answer, your highness,"
Giles said angrily beside him, eyes boring into her.
"Prince Frida's family is worried sick,"
Alexander went on, trying to remain calm.
"We know your true form now. There's no point in keeping her hidden."
"I might have killed her," the witch said absently.
"No, you didn't," Alexander said, grinding his teeth. "You said she was hidden. Now tell me where!"
She simply stared at her reflection in the small pool of water on the cell floors. It had rained all day, and the air was now muggy and damp. It only added to Alexander's irritation.
"Look," he went on, "perhaps we can make a deal. Some leniency on your sentence for information on the princess's location."
The witch stared at the water for a moment longer, then smiled and looked up at him. "You'll find her on the Isle 20 Leagues southeast of Montpellier."
"So far?" Giles asked.
"Oh, and you'll need to wait until the next new moon. She won't be there before then."
"That's nearly a month away," Alexander realised. "Where is she now? Who has her?"
The witch looked back down at the puddle beside her fingertips. "Nowhere. No one." He frowned. Perhaps if she hired someone to transport the princess to the location, she wouldn't know.
"Well, if this proves true, I'm sure it's considered during your trial,"
he said. Strangely, the witch only chuckled. "Thank you for the offer, dear prince," she said, her hand now floating over the surface of the water. It began to change, to grow dark. "But I can take care of myself." In an instant she was gone, the puddle's surface quivering for a moment before settling back in the grey reflection of the cell walls. The chains that had bound her fell into a heap on the floor.
The two men were stunned silent for a long minute. "Damn," Giles swore at last.
Alexander only stared at the floor, gripping the cell's bars.
"Damn is right," he said. "Who knew she could use a water's reflection as well?"
He furrowed his brows, as he thought.
"I should have. Perhaps I should have." "If you had her executed, we would never be able to find the Prussian princess," Giles observed. Alexander pursed his lips. "As long as she didn't feed us false information." They were quiet for several minutes, the prince pacing the narrow corridor, while the head of his troop stood calm. "My lord, if I may?" Giles started. Alexander looked over at him. The man cleared his throat, adjusting one of the gold rings in his ear. "You may wish to announce her banishment, in order to explain her disappearance," he said, looking back at the empty cell. Prince Alexander followed his gaze nervously. "I don't want to lie," he said quietly. "I only suggest it as a safety measure. Wouldn't want to start a panic. And I would wish not of our enemies to think us weak. It would be much better to report her absence as the result of a firm decision on your part." Alexander nodded. He could see the logic in that, and Giles had dealt with such things much longer than he. "Do you think she'll return?" he wondered, aloud. Perhaps, the man conceded. But if it's a fight she wants, we'll be ready for her.
Line break, still in the flashback.
Princess and Frida?
The girl huddled against the brush beside a shimmering pool, trembling head to toe. She wore the fine robes of her countrymen, barely a stain on their surface. Her hair was done up as though a servant had placed some light curls themselves that very morning. Alexander frowned. Not that none of that mattered. After a 2-month journey, they'd finally found her. And somehow she was still alive. Though her form was the same as the witch had impersonated, she seemed so much younger as herself.
Was I really supposed to marry this child?
He thought, feeling a pang in his gut.
Princessin, it's me, Prince Alexander of France.
She finally looked up at him, though there was no recognition in her eyes. She says something here, in her tongue, eyes filling with tears. I can't read that. It looks German, I think. Prussian German, I don't know. Alexander looked behind him where Sir Giles stood in the thick vegetation.
She wishes to go home, Your Highness,
he interpreted. Alexander looked back down at her and nodded. She let him help her to her feet and guided her back to the ship, still wondering what on earth he had done to that witch to cause such trouble. Line break. Still in the flashback.
Father, with everything that's happened, well, Princess Frida wishes to return to her family for the unforeseeable future. So I was thinking perhaps it would be best if we simply, well, if we went ahead and broke off this engagement and... Alexander,
his father said gruffly,
if you wanted to marry that woman you've been seeing, just come out and say it.
The prince blinked.
You knew about that?
He asked in shock. Of course I know about it. I'm not a fool. The king huffed. I've already met the girl, in fact.
You have?
Yes, the king said irritably, waving his hand in the air.
I brought her here to see me just this morning.
Alexander's heart flew to his throat, and he nearly fled the room in an instant.
He hadn't seen Jacqueline since the night before. Was she alright? Had his father threatened her? Oh God, he thought. What was I thinking? I should have sent her somewhere safe before father came back and... Her status is certainly not ideal, his father went on, unaware of his son's anxiety. But I do admit the woman has a certain charm about her, he admitted. Alexander's mouth fell open in surprise. How did Jacqueline actually manage to break into his father's cold heart? He felt himself smiling, knowing that if anyone could, it would be her. The king suddenly fell into a fit of dry coughs for a long minute, before sitting back tiredly against the pillows of the grand bed. Good Lord! I could barely make a summer trip anymore without feeling like I've aged a decade,
he muttered. The prince was quiet for a long moment.
So, I have your blessing?
He asked carefully. And by blessing he really meant permission. And though he knew, no matter what his father's answer, he would find a way to be with her, even if it meant leaving his place behind forever.
Alexander, I'm far too old to go through all of the fuss of arranging your betrothal twice, his father said. Just get yourself an heir before I go the way of this world, and I'll be satisfied. I know I'll never have an easy rest in my grave, knowing Victor is second in line. You might have a brain full of useless ideas, but at least you have one. That boy's not a fool. He'll lay waste to this kingdom in a fortnight, no doubt. Yes, father, Alexander breathed. Thank you, he cried, standing and racing from the room. Jacqueline produced an heir a year later. The old king granted his approval, passing the kinship to his son in order to live his final years in peace. Alexander, for his part, had never been happier in his life. He had a wife he loved, a son with her eyes, and soon to be revealed, her gentle temperament. In fact, so happy was Alexander, that it really wasn't long until he forgot all about spells and red eyes. Though, of course, someday they would return to haunt him. Line break in the present but a different location. A man gasped at the sound of footsteps, waking with a start. He closed his eyes again, trying desperately to cling to the last bits of the memories that had filled his dreams. Of playful blue eyes, the laughter of a boy atop his shoulders, and the touch of a woman long since taken from him. While only in his 40s, the man didn't know it. He could have been twice his true age as far as he was aware. How long have I been here?
He wondered for the umpteenth time. scratching at the flaking skin beneath his long knotted beard. He blinked against the darkness, eyes long since adjusted to the shadows of his cell. Thick fog crept through the window. It never seemed to stop. A sliver of light fell across the prison occupants some days, though it never lasted more than a few hours before shrouding them in darkness again. The cell's windows itself were unbarred, and no fatal drop resided on the other side. In fact, bits of the wall around him had crumbled away, opening into the dark forest that surrounded them. It wouldn't have been difficult to crack the holes wide open enough for a man to fit through. Yet he could never do it. For, like the rest of this prison, no bars or locks blocked his escape, but a strange force as hard as bricks that no human eye could see. It encased him on all sides, like a giant invisible box. And while it allowed anyone else to pass in and out freely, its occupant was still very much trapped. Two forms moved into view, stepping out of one of the dozen dim mirrors lining the hall. One was a younger man, and he put up no argument as he was tossed like a rag doll in the cell across the way.
A newcomer,
the older prisoner realised absently. It wasn't the first. In fact, recently it seemed the witch was set to break her own record for the number of victims she brought within these walls. As though harvesting from those already here wasn't enough for whatever scheme she had plotted next. "You're not eating enough, Your Majesty." Alexander looked up. The very woman herself now cocked her head at him from beyond the threshold of his invisible cage. She stared with disapproval at the bowl at his feet, the contents yet untouched.
"Why should I eat, when you'll just steal away any strength I gain?"
he rasped. The words were rough, painful against his dry throat. It had been a while since he'd spoken to anyone. Of course he spoke to the others here, at least when they first came. Or tried to anyway. But sitting in a dark room for years on end, and one eventually ran out of things to say. She was before him now, crouching down to his level, lips as red as blood, and eyes to match. He hated those eyes, almost as much as the lips that now pressed against his. He had long since given up the fight against the enchanted chains that held him in place, while she pulled his lifeblood away.
"Perhaps this is my punishment,"
he thought numbly, feeling the small store of strength he had managed to preserve quickly vanish from his limbs.
"Perhaps I never deserved Jacqueline. Never deserved my son."
It made sense, after all. He had lived a life of selfishness, of pride, of neglect, for those below him until Jacqueline came along. Did he really expect a few apologies and a personality adjustment would make him worthy of true happiness? The witch stood again, licking her lips and sighing deeply. "Really, it would be so much more helpful if you would eat. You're practically skin and bones. I doubt your son would even recognize you."
Alexander snarled. "What does it matter? I'll never see him again."
The witch watched him for a long moment, then grinned. "Why, Alexander," she said, "why didn't you just ask?" Stepping back into the hall, she touched one of the grand mirrors lining its walls. The surface seemed to break into life, and the once king raised a hand to his face as it glowed against the darkness. Blinking against the onslaught of light, his vision came back into focus. He gasped.
"What is that?"
he gasped in confusion, watching as a giant creature pattered across the frame. It walked on its hind legs, clad in the clothes of a man. He looked back up at the witch.
"Why are you showing me this monster?"
She laughed cruelly. "Dear king, surely you wouldn't say such a thing about your own son."
Alexander's heart caught in his throat. "No," he breathed. "No! You swore you wouldn't hurt him!"
"Did I?" she mocked. "If I recall, I only promised not to kill him. And my little beast is perfectly well, I can assure you."
Alexander clenched his fists, his long, unkempt nails piercing his own flesh in his fury. "Damn you!" he growled, sucking in a heated breath. "Damn you!"
"In fact, your dear son is my prisoner too," the witch went on, ignoring him. "Don't worry, I've given him a much larger cage than you." The king's anger quickly melted into grief as he watched this strange creature. Could it really be his son, from beyond the mirror's surface? Soon another figure entered the vision. A woman. She was lovely and young, and when she approached Adam's monstrous form, she reached for him with a gentle hand. Alexander couldn't quite smile, but he did let a bit of hope seep into his chest.
"Even with such a curse, he's capable of love," he realized. "His goodness, is still seen by others, even once so beautiful.
Yes, he's a bit distracted right now, the witch admitted, frowning at the image, but I'll soon fix that.
Alexander's eyes grew wide, and he tore them from the mirror to look back at his captor. Why? He cried. What more will you take from us? Wasn't killing my wife enough?
Her mouth formed a small O in surprise. So you finally put that together, Alexander? She realised. You're not quite right, though. Close, but not quite right.
He frowned deeply. He was certain the witch had been tormenting Jacqueline all those years ago. He had watched the enchantress come in and out of the prison mirrors for years, seen her appear in 1,000 different forms before his very eyes. It hadn't taken long to realise who Jacqueline really had been seeing, who truly had led her into that storm that dreadful night.
You don't believe me? The witch went on. I'm telling the truth, you know. Yes, I might have haunted the woman per se, but I didn't kill her.
No, you let the wolves do that, Alexander said in a quiet rage.
Not quite, she said with a strange pride. So sure of her fate. Yet did you ever find a body?
He froze. They had found a long strip of cloth, coated in fresh blood which painted the snow surrounding it. Yet the hunting dogs had found no trail to her remains. A battalion of men had searched the woods twice over for miles and miles, much further than even a man could have gone in the same amount of time. If it weren't for the blood-soaked cloth, far from any cliffs, Alexander would have assumed she had fallen into an unreachable chasm. So instead he had finally accepted that the wolves had reached her, and had left nothing behind for him to find. Or, if they had, it was long lost beneath the falling snow and long gone by spring. But now he knew more. More about this self-proclaimed enchantress, about the men she had dragged through these mirrors from across the countryside. Is it possible? He wondered. Is Jacqueline still alive? Where is she? He breathed, the quaking of his heart spilling into his limbs, his fingers. He stood, ignoring his aching legs and throwing 2 fists against the clear wall. Tell me where she is! The woman smirked.
She's somewhere you can never reach. At least, not yet.
Not yet? He said in desperation. He shook his head, snarling in fury. God damn it, woman! Answer the question! Where is my wife?
Always asking the wrong questions. The witch tutted. She leaned close, red eyes glowing with victory. Not where she is, dear Alexander. When? End of chapter. Hi guys, hope you enjoyed that one because oh my god, my throat is sore. But I'll give you this outro. What a backstory! Now I want to say something. I am very firmly against the idea of a woman's love saving a man. I'm very much against that. In Beauty and the Beast, as well as this flashback about the Beast's in this version's parents, I like this idea. That he takes inspiration from the woman and then uses it to improve himself. He doesn't do it for her, and he doesn't do it like in order to gain her love. He does it because he's inspired, and I find that very admirable. I love how Jacqueline is really smart as well. I'm sorry if her voice changed a bit. I'm still trying. I'm trying to make her sound warm but still young, which is honestly quite hard, at least to me. Oh boy, and I tried to make Adam's and Alexander's voices the same. And this witch really cannot stop messing with this family, can she? Oh my god. Anyway, you guys know the drill. Like, comment and subscribe, yada yada yada. Make sure to have a good day, night, or whatever time zone you're in. Look after yourselves, my guys, gals, and non-binary pals. I'll see you in another video. Bye!